Hello and welcome to Business Africa with me, Ronald Kato. This week, after 2 years of fighting, Ethiopia and rebels have reached a settlement. But the war's toll on the economy has been massive. Debt has gone up and sanctions have hurt exports and jobs. We'll report on whether a peace treaty can help jumpstart Ethiopia's economy. Plus, who are the winners and losers of the COP27? We'll report on why there were no major victories for developing countries despite showing up with a long list of wishes. Also, a bright future for African fashion. We meet an entrepreneur working to end Africa's underrepresentation among the major global fashion brands. Stay with us for the details. Thank you for joining us. As Ethiopia marshaled resources to beat off rampaging rebels, its economy, already weakened by a pandemic, became a casualty. The country's credit ratings have been downgraded and sanctions have hurt jobs and exports. Multilaterals, too, are hesitant to extend financing. But there is now hope that the peace deal could help breathe new life into Addis Ababa's economy.
Ethiopia and Tigray rebels have signed a peace deal, but not before 2 years of ferocious fighting and economic devastation. Amidst the war and the pandemic, Addis Ababa's GDP slowed from 9% in 2019 to 6.1% in 2020, 6.2% in 2021. The IMF predicts growth of just 3.8% in 2022. The country also faces mounting debt and has run to its lenders seeking relief. But that too is dependent on whether the government can agree a financing deal with the IMF. Dwindling foreign exchange reserves have piled pressure on the birr, eating off an inflationary spiral within the country. Because of the conflict, Addis Ababa also lost its duty-free access to the United States market, a major source of foreign exchange and jobs. The ban pushed several manufacturers to close their textile-making facilities. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's privatization and reform drive also became a casualty of the war as plans to open up key sectors such as banking lost momentum. Overall, the conflict has been a loss for Ethiopia's image as a top FDI destination in this year of double-digit growth. With a peace deal, there is optimism that counting on its big population and vast electricity generation capacity, Ethiopia can quickly forge an economic comeback.
My guest is Zemedene Negatu. He's the chairman of the Fairfax Africa Fund. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. What opportunities does this peace settlement unlock for Ethiopia's economy?
Enormous opportunities. And first and foremost, if the country was able to grow by 4.5%, 5% the last 2.5 years, well, I don't think there's any doubt that it has the capacity to regain its momentum. And if not this year, certainly in 23 and 24, to reach double digit, which it used to do for a number of years. So peace, I think I'll call it the peace dividend, is very, very significant. And perhaps I can quantify it for you very, very quickly. There's the last 2 years, Ethiopia has been under sanctions from the United States, from the European Union, billions of dollars that have been approved by the IMF and the World Bank pre-COVID, pre the conflict, was held up. Something like $4 billion for the Europeans, billions of euros. So when you can imagine now there's peace treaty, these billions will be released. So that'll give the Ethiopian economy a very significant boost on top of the confidence that both domestic and foreign investors will now start having.
Zem, Ethiopia has sought to restructure its debt, and lenders have made it clear to Addis Ababa that it has to reach a deal first with the IMF. Is there a chance now that this deal could be imminent with the peace deal?
There are two things here. One is, as I mentioned earlier, releasing funds that have already been approved. Secondly, as you mentioned, the debt restructuring. So Ethiopia actually is one of the 3 countries in Africa that early on, I think about two years ago, requested for debt restructuring. But now, as I said, it looks like they will re-engage Ethiopia. And definitely that's another big plus for the economy, because Ethiopia's foreign external debt is about $30 billion. So any form of relief, whether it's restructuring, extending it over a longer period of time, or even in some cases outright writing it off, will give a huge boost to Ethiopia, because the dollar earnings that it gets from, from abroad, from FDI, from exports, from diaspora remittance, all that could now be channeled to productive sectors.
Speaking of debt, there is a Eurobond payment Ethiopia has to make in 2023. But what happens if the IMF deal cannot come through fast enough? How concerned are people in charge of Ethiopia's finances, you think?
Let me give you some indication. As a percentage of GDP, Ethiopia's debt is actually moderate risk. Where the challenge has been is debt to exports. So Ethiopia has been focusing on increasing its exports. In the last 3 years, it has actually been fairly successful. And this past year was a record year for exports. So if it can continue to increase its sources of hard currency, my view and others who I've talked to in Washington has been, over the next few months, it won't take much longer than that. Over the next few months, I think you should expect to see release of funds from the IMF and the World Bank. Perhaps the debt restructuring might take a bit longer, but at least a mere indication to creditors that this is in process, as opposed to a stalled process the last, 18 months. There was no movement on the debt restructuring side. That by itself, I think, will boost confidence.
Zem, after seemingly putting the brakes on privatization, Ethiopia has now announced that it is looking to sell a stake in Ethio Telecom. Is Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed still committed to ambitious economic reforms, you think?
About 6-8 weeks ago, the cabinet approved the entry of foreign banks into Ethiopia. It's been debated endlessly over the last 25 years. Should we allow foreign banks or not? So it was a historic decision, because the last time Ethiopia had foreign banks was 50 years ago. Second, if you look at the telecom sector, as you know, a year and 18 months ago, a Safaricom-led consortium won the bid by paying $850 million to acquire the first private mobile telecom license in Ethiopia in 126 years. You get that? 126 years. It was a pure monopoly. So these are reforms that are continuing.
Zemedene Negatu, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Now, barely polluting and yet desperate for jobs and growth, African countries arrived in Sharm el-Sheikh defiant, vowing to develop their natural resources to end poverty. But the climate summit, billed as Africa's COP, only delivered a mix of disappointment and hope for developing countries.
The just concluded climate talks were billed by some as Africa's opportunity to make itself heard, to get concessions out of the developed world. But as previous summits have shown, developing countries get no easy wins at climate talks.
I think it was unfair from the beginning to even label it an African COP, if I'm honest. I think we got a COP at a time when the geopolitical situation already told us what we could expect. The expectation that this would be an African COP was unrealistic, really.
The establishment of a loss and damage fund to address the devastating consequences of climate change has been hailed as a landmark decision, except it is not the first to be set up. Previous funds have suffered resourcing and access issues, leaving developing nations with unmet climate financing needs.
It's one thing to have a fund for loss and damage, it's something else to resource it. And I think particularly in the absence of new pledges on adaptation finance, we haven't moved an inch on any new commitments.
Africa needs $200 billion annually to help it meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That the summit also did not order compensation for developing countries to spare their oil and gas rich will also count as a loss in Africa.
Africans remain underrepresented among the major global fashion brands. But the founder of the Johannesburg and Cape Town Fashion Weeks is working to see more African designers ascend the global stage.
South Africa's Precious Moloi Motsepe, one of the richest women in Africa, is a staunch promoter of fashion designers from the young, vibrant and culturally diverse continent. Style has coursed through her veins since she was a young girl growing up in Soweto Township. And for her, the time is ripe for African designers to shine on the international platform.
People in the creative industry actually get their inspiration from history, heritage, culture, which I thought Africa had plenty of. We're such a diverse nation of 54 countries, different languages, and so many different cultures. But I wasn't seeing that representation of our cultures on any of the runways.
A decade and a half ago, she founded the Johannesburg and Cape Town Fashion Weeks that bring together designers from across the continent with the aim of setting them up for the global stage.
So it is really a platform that seeks to raise the profile of African creatives for Africa and to ensure that we can bring that to global audiences so that they can interact with it in a commercial way.
Africans remain underrepresented among the major global brands, something Motsepe says she's working to change.
And that wraps up this episode of Business Africa. I am Ronald Kato. The news continues on air and online. Bye for now, and I'll see you on the next episode of Business Africa.